March the 28th, 1889, broke at 29 degrees and a wind that shaved skin like dull glass. Laura Harmon stood knee-deep in last week's drift where the canyon spur crossed Dry Creek's old side channel, driving an iron probe through fresh railroad fill. The rod went down easy for 2 feet, struck clay, then dropped again into a hollow she could feel more than hear. An underground slosh under packed gravel. Behind her, a locomotive coughed black smoke into a pale sky. Below, the town's new depot windows flashed sunrise like church silver. She withdrew the rod and held it to her cheek. Cold water beaded on the tip. "Still saying it?" called Eli from the wagon track, voice cracking from 15 years in morning chill. He had a sack of oats over one shoulder and their mother's shovel on the other, trying to walk like a man. Laura looked from the embankment to town. Boardwalks, false front stores, worker tents by the rail yard, and beyond them the row of new mansions with iron gates where Cutter and Vale, the Red Sovereign's barons, threw winter parties lit by imported lamps. "I'm saying it louder," she answered. "This is a dam pretending to be a railbed." By noon, the rod marks would be gone under wagon ruts. By spring storm, if she was right, half Dry Creek could be gone too. People said the Harmons lived up on Widow Ridge, as if misfortune itself had an address. The place was 6 acres of rock and stubborn bunch grass above town, leased cheap because nobody wanted land that broke plow teeth. Their old place, the bottom land with the cottonwoods, the true creek crossing, and the best well for 10 miles, sat below the new spur, cut up by stakes and legal notices and men with polished boots. The railroad called it a survey correction. Judge Bell called it settled title. Cutter and Vale called it progress. Ruth Harmon called it theft in a clean collar. When Laura was 12 and Eli still rode sacks instead of saddles, Ruth had taught them frontier arithmetic by lantern light, while their father coughed himself thinner in the bed alcove. 1 week of flour was 49 pounds if you expected weather delay. 1 horse needed 12 pounds of hay a day in hard cold. 1 broken axle in January could cost a life if you trusted a single road out. After their father died, Ruth sharpened those lessons into rules and repeated them until they sounded like prayer. Red snowpack by wind crust, not color. Cash grain above flood lines even in dry years. Keep extra harness leather where mice and damp can't reach. Never trust 1 bridge, 1 well, 1 boss, 1 road. By 1889, storemen in Dry Creek laughed at those rules. The railroad sold certainty now. Scheduled freight, telegraph news, regular coal, modern culverts stamped with company marks, widow superstitions. The newspaper called Ruth's cautions when she paid cash for spare lamp oil and salt in January. Yet every bit of Harmon's living still came from those old rules. Laura, 23 and broad-shouldered from shovel work, kept a grease pencil map on the kitchen wall marking forgotten creek braids and spring seeps. Eli checked wind crust each dawn before turning out their draft pair, Buck and June. Ruth bartered mending for nails and seeded barley in narrow strips where basalt held heat. Their house wasn't much, a 2-room board structure patched with flattened kerosene tins, but behind it they had built what town folk mocked as Harmon's Ark. It was practical, ugly, and exact. A cistern pit 12 feet long by 6 wide by 7 deep, lined with lime wash and scavenged stone, covered with 2-inch pine planks tarred at the seams. A root cellar driven 8 feet into basalt with pick and star drill, roofed in railroad ties bought secondhand at 80 cents each. 3 grain bins raised on stacked fieldstone 18 inches above grade, so runoff could pass under. 2 spare yokes hung in the rafters, leather wrapped in waxed cloth against damp. A handcart path cut to the upper pasture where 100 people could stand if flood took the flats. The barbershop crowd told jokes about it over coffee. Laura heard most of those jokes while buying lye, nails, and coarse salt she could barely afford. She kept buying. What drove her wasn't only anger over lost land. Anger burned hot and quick. What drove her was memory measured in inches of water and minutes of warning. She remembered being 9 when a cloudburst turned Willow Draw into a wall and took the McNabb boy before anyone had boots on. She remembered her father, fevered and whispering, pointing at a hand-sketched map. Water always takes old roads when you force it. She remembered Judge Bell refusing to hear their appeal, while Cutter's clerk smiled into his hat. So she studied the spur embankment every day, rod and notebook in hand, while men called her bitter. On the first Monday of April, the town hall hosted a public hearing on Red Sovereign's plan to extend track deeper into the canyon for spring blasting contracts. The hall smelled of wet wool and cigar ash. Cutter sat front row in a black frock coat, Vail beside him, gloves pale as bone. The sheriff leaned against the stove. Shopkeepers filled the benches. A few track workers stood in back with faces unreadable. When the clerk called for public comment, Laura rose with rolled maps under her arm. "Name," the clerk said, though he knew it. "Laura Harmon." A murmur moved through the room. Someone coughed. "Here comes the flood sermon." She laid 2 maps on the table. One from county survey sheets before correction, one she had drawn from field measurements. "You block the natural spillway here," she said, finger on the canyon throat. "Your fill across this channel is 14 feet high at centerline, near 70 yards long. Culvert capacity's wrong for spring runoff, especially with snowpack this year. Water is already backing under the grade." Vail didn't look at the maps. "Miss Harmon has contested title in this area and may be motivated by grievance." Cutter smiled for the room. "Progress has opponents. We sympathize." Laura kept her voice flat. "This isn't grievance. It's flow. First hard cloudburst. You'll send a wall into Dry Creek and the rail yard both. Worker quarter takes it first." A few in back shifted. The sheriff straightened. Judge Bell, chairing as if this were a court and not a hearing, tapped his gavel once. Noted. "Company engineers certify safety." "Show their calculations," Laura said. Gavel again, sharper. "Noted." By the time she stepped outside, sleet had started. Small, hard pellets that bounced on the boardwalk like shot. A marshal waited by the hitch rail with a folded notice and embarrassed eyes. "Miss Harmon, Mrs. Harmon." Ruth, who had stood silent through the hearing, took the paper. Red wax seal. Final notice. Vacate leased pasture by month's end. Failure subject to seizure of stock for unpaid use and penalties. Their draft team would be homeless in 3 weeks unless they found board they could not pay for. Ruth read the line twice, then folded it cleanly. "Thank you, Marshal." He tipped his hat and left fast, as if speed might spare him shame. Eli kicked slush off his boot and stared at the closed hall doors. "They mean to strip us down to hand tools." Laura looked at the notice, then at the dark line of cloud piling above the canyon. "Then, we work faster." They began that afternoon in plain sight. Laura sold her father's silver watch for $11 at Klein's Mercantile and wrote every cent into a ledger. 120 gunny sacks at 3 cents each, $3.60. 4 shovels, second hand, mixed heads, $2, 2 coils, hemp rope, 50 feet each, $1.40. 1 keg cut nails, 20 pounds, $1.10. 3 barrels used for water storage, $1.80. Lamp oil, salt pork, flour remainder, $1.10. Ruth traded 2 weeks sewing to the livery for stall space for Buck and June through May if they supplied feed. Eli and Laura hauled creek sand by wagon, filled sacks to 35 pounds each, and stacked them 2 courses high along the low side of their ridge yard, where overflow might undercut the house. Eli marked each stack with charcoal date and count like a quartermaster. 48, 96, 144. They cut drainage trenches with a transit level borrowed from a retired freighter who still trusted Ruth's judgment. Main trench, 180 feet from upper swale to old basalt crack, 3 feet wide at top, 18 inches at base, fall of 9 inches across full run, enough to move water without scouring if lined. Side channels, 2 runs at 60 feet each, aimed not at town, but toward abandoned orchard ground uphill of Mansion Row where land could soak and spread. "Too much trouble for dry weather," called a passing teamster. "Dry weather doesn't send warnings," Ruth answered, not looking up. By week's end, the newspaper printed a column titled "Married to Calamity," mocking Laura as a young lady more devoted to disaster than domestic prospects. Eli cut it from the sheet and used it to light the stove. Still, people watched. A Chinese section hand named Lin came at dusk with a mattock and no speech beyond nods. Next night, he brought 2 more men. Then came Mrs. McNabb, widowed by that old flood, carrying her own shovel. Then Clara Fisk from the laundry with spare blankets to store dry in the cellar. They worked quietly. No speeches, no hall votes. Laura kept trying official channels anyway. She telegraphed the line superintendent in Cheyenne. Request delay of midnight freights. During forecast storms. Stop embankment, backwater verified. Stop no reply. She filed petition copies with the sheriff. He warned her against agitating labor camps. She went to Cutter and Vale's gatehouse in daylight, hat in hand, and asked to show flow maps. Guards blocked the walk. "Orders are no panic visitors," one said. "Panic hurts investment. Flood hurts breathing," Laura said. He shut the gate. Rain came in earnest 3 nights later, steady and cold. Tin roofs drummed from dusk onward. At the edge of their former bottomland stood an abandoned signal shack, half-rotted, where Eli had scavenged wiring for lantern repairs. Near midnight, he begged Laura to help reset a warped door so supplies could stay dry. They crossed slick ground with 1 lantern and a pry bar, boots sinking in mud that had been their bean patch before the survey correction. Inside, dust and mouse droppings, an old stove and a dispatch shelf with cracked glass. Eli wrestled hinges while Laura sorted rusted relay parts by lamplight. Wind pushed rain through the broken eaves in silver threads. Then the telegraph sounder clicked to life from the main line feed, weak but clear. Laura froze, hand above the key. A dispatcher's rhythm rattled through. Schedule amendments, mileposts, weather cautions. She copied by habit on scrap paper, pencil moving fast. Extra freight 14. Powder consignment. Depart East Junction, 9:40 p.m. Past Dry Creek, cut approx 12:17 a.m. Priority clear track. Another line followed, clipped Storm Watch, Canyon District. Eli looked up from the hinge, face pale in lantern glow. "Powder? Tonight?" "Tomorrow night," Laura said, checking date mark twice. Her pulse beat hard behind her eyes. Midnight through the cut. In Storm Watch. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere above the blocked spillway, long and low like distant wheels. Laura folded the dispatch slip and tucked it into her coat. "Eli," she said, already moving for the door. "Wake Ma. We don't have weeks anymore. We have 1 night to make them listen." Ruth was already awake when they burst in. She sat at the table in her night shawl, lamp trimmed low, darning harness traced by instinct more than sight. She did not ask why. Laura laid the damp dispatch slip beside the needle. "Powder train tomorrow. Through the cut at 12:17. Storm Watch posted." Ruth read once, then slid the slip back with 2 fingers, careful as if it might burn. "Then we prepare for blast and flood together." Eli swallowed. "Can they move it?" Only if somebody with a title says so, Laura said, and titles are asleep in feather beds. Ruth stood, tied back her hair, and reached for boots. Then we work while they sleep. At first light, Laura turned the kitchen wall map into orders. She drew a grid with charcoal and listed tasks by hour, assigning names in a hand that did not shake. Water control. Deepen main trench to 30 inches at choke point. Line first, 40 feet with stone to prevent bank collapse. Cut emergency notch on west berm, plugged with sandbags until needed. Clear old willow swale of brush and fence wire. Supplies/shelter. Fill all 3 barrels and kettle reserve. Move flour/salt pork/beans to cellar shelves above knee height. Stage blankets in waxed bundles by door. Lanterns. Trim 11 wicks. Fill. Set in pairs on route markers. Animals/transport. Move Buck and June to upper pasture by dusk. Hitch wagon with spare tongue and chain. Grease handcar axles. Check pump handles. Cache 2 sled drags near ridge trailhead alert/evacuation. Mark foot routes with white rags at eye level. Knock each worker tent row before dark. Post warning at depot and church door. Telegraph superintendent, division office, and freight dispatcher. Under it she wrote, in Ruth's words, "Never trust one road out." By 7, they were in motion. Eli and Lynn pried stones from a collapsed boundary wall and carried them in gunny slings to the trench mouth. Laura set line stakes every 12 feet and used the borrowed transit to check fall. Too steep and water would cut a gully that ate the trench itself. Too flat, and it would pond and spill where they could not predict. She adjusted by shovel bite, shaving high points, tamping low points with the back of an adze. 3 inches down at stake 5, she called. Lynn crouched, sighted along the string, nodded once, and hacked clay free with the mattock. His 2 cousins worked silently beside him, laying fist-sized rock against trench sides like rough masonry. Ruth ran logistics with the relentlessness of winter feeding. She set Eli's slate by the porch post and made him write counts each trip. Sandbags filled, 212 by noon. Barrels filled, 3 full, 1 half. Kettle reserve. Drywood bundles to cellar, 14. Blanket rolls sealed, 23. Lamp oil tins topped, 9. By mid-morning, half the town had heard they were building a private moat and charging admission to the deluge. The jokes sharpened. At Toller's feed store, men stepped aside only enough to make Laura brush wet shoulders as she passed. One said loudly, "Best buy a bonnet boat, Harmon. Calamity brides need proper trim." Laughter followed like thrown gravel. At the bakery window, 2 women Laura had gone to school with lowered their voices just enough for her to hear. "I'd lock my daughters in before I let them near that ridge. They've got labor camp men up there at night. Not proper, any of it." At church board meeting, Reverend Coates read prayer requests and then, without naming her, added that disorderly alarm can be as sinful as neglect. 3 pews turned to look at Ruth. The newspaper escalated from ridicule to warning. The afternoon broadside carried an unsigned note. Citizens are advised not to heed unauthorized hazard claims spread by parties in active land dispute with red sovereign interests. Panic provocation may invite legal consequences. The word legal did more work than any storm cloud. People who might have listened shut their doors instead. When Mrs. McNabb arrived with Clara Fisk and old Mrs. Pruitt from the North Road, Ruth handed each a task as if assigning church supper dishes. No one stood idle long enough for fear to root. Mrs. Pruitt slit feed sacks into strips for root ties. Clara and Eli boiled pitch to waterproof crate lids. Mrs. McNabb helped Laura set 2 hinged floodgates made from scavenged planks at the side channels. Simple drop boards pinned with iron rods. If surge came too hard, they could pull pins and turn water away from the worker quarter toward open ground uphill from the Baron's lawns. By noon, the sheriff rode up the ridge with 2 deputies and the county surveyor. Their horses sank fetlock deep in mud near the trench head. Sheriff Dunn lifted his slicker collar and looked over the cut channels, bag walls, and stacked crates with tight displeasure. "You were marking routes across company parcel," he said, pointing at white rags tied along the old creek crossing. "Remove them." "They lead from worker tents to high ground," Laura said. "They cross posted land. They cross the shortest line to breathing." Dunn's jaw worked. "Miss Harmon, I'll not have you stirring camp hands into trespass and riot." "Is walking uphill now riot?" One deputy smirked. Dunn did not. He handed her a folded paper protected in oilskin. "Notice of complaint. Red Sovereign alleges interference with operations and defamatory claims." Ruth took the paper before Laura could crumple it. "Filed where?" "Judge Bell's court. Hearing next week." "Next week won't help a midnight train," Laura said. Dunn looked past her toward the valley where rain veiled the depot roof. For a moment, his expression slipped from authority into something like fatigue. "You keep your people off the track and off company gates. That's my warning. Next time is arrest." He turned his horse. The deputies followed, one of them kicking over a pile of root stakes as he went. Eli lunged forward. Ruth caught his arm hard enough to bruise. "Not worth a jail cell," she said under her breath. "Pick them up after." When the riders were gone, silence held for 3 breaths. Then Lynn knelt and reset the knocked stakes without a word. Clara did the same. Eli bent with them, jaw clenched, eyes bright with rage he did not spend. By early afternoon, the yard looked like a small fortification. The main trench ran dark and clean, a measured scar across the slope. Side channels branched like fingers. Sandbags made low crescent walls around the house corners, the cistern hatch, and the cellar entrance. Stakes with white rag streamers marked a night path from road to cellar, then onward to upper pasture. Every 40 yards they planted a post with a lantern hook and tinderbox wrapped in oilcloth. Laura rode the wagon down to town twice, wheels throwing mud. She nailed notices where she could before anyone tore them down. Heavy runoff risk. Move children and bedding above depot grade. Before midnight. Avoid canyon cut during storm. Powder freight scheduled. 12:17 a.m. Shelter available on Harmon Ridge. If flood rises at the telegraph office, she pushed 2 silver dimes through the wicket and dictated in clipped words to save cost. To Superintendent Harlan, Cheyenne. Request hold extra 14 powder until canyon. Embankment inspected stop backwater. Observed continuing storm. Stop liability. Extreme to dispatch. East Junction. Local citizen reports. Subgrade saturation at Dry Creek. Cut. Stop urgent speed restriction or hold order. Requested to County Clerk and Judge Bell. Both. Formal notice potential. Public hazard from obstructed spillway filed. Prior dates reiterated stop. The operator, Mr. Pike, kept his eyes on the key, not her face. "No guarantee on response times." "Send receipt copy then," Laura said. He hesitated. "That costs extra." She put down another coin she needed for flour. "Send it." By mid-afternoon, no replies had come. The social line tightened through the same wet hours. The livery owner, who had promised stall space for Buck and June, sent a boy with a message. Arrangement canceled. Pressure from regular clients. Klein's Mercantile suddenly had no credit for Harmon's, not even at Ruth's mending account. At the pump, a woman Laura did not know refused to pass the dipper after Eli drank. "I won't catch hysteria," she said. Even those who pitied kept distance. Mrs. Hale from the boarding house slipped Laura a sack of stale rolls near day's last gray light, glancing over her shoulder as if charity itself were contraband. "I can't be seen up there," she whispered. "My husband works yard inventory." "We'll still feed anybody who comes," Laura answered. Mrs. Hale's mouth trembled. She nodded and hurried away. That afternoon, Laura went one more time to Cutter and Vale's gatehouse, rain sheeting off her hat brim. Gas lamps burned behind the iron bars. Through them she could see manicured paths, imported furs, marble statuary wrapped in tarps against weather. A guard she recognized stepped out under the arch. "No visitors." "It's not a visit." Laura held out the dispatch copy, already blurred at the edges. "Powder freight tomorrow midnight. Storm in canyon. If your embankment fails in the cut." He lifted a gloved palm. "Miss, I was told by Mr. Vale himself. No meetings with claim agitators. I am warning you to wake your own families." He gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Our engineers are educated men." "So is water," she said. The gate stayed shut. She rode back in the dark, mud splashing to her knees, and found Ruth at the table cutting cloth strips for bandages. Eli sat nearby with a railroad timetable and Laura's field notes spread together, drawing arrows where paths met. "How bad in town?" Ruth asked. "Worse," Laura said, hanging her coat. "Good. Means they're scared." Eli looked up. "Scared people do stupid." "Scared people also run when whistle blows," Laura said. "We just have to make sure they hear one." The weather turned from steady rain to violent pattern by evening. Hard bursts, brief lulls, then harder bursts, each one chewing at banks already soft. Laura watched signs the way others watched clocks. In the draw east of Ridge, the ant line broke and moved uphill in thick, dark ropes carrying white larvae, flood instinct. At sunset, swallows that usually skimmed low over the yard flew high and inland, abandoning insect swarms over wet ground. Buck and June, ordinarily calm in storm, rolled their eyes and pulled against halters before thunder even sounded. In the old willow swale below the stolen bottomland, water appeared where no surface stream ran, seeping upward through pale sand in little boiling domes, pressure from a perched table behind Phil. Laura knelt, touched it, smelled raw clay and iron. At the canyon spur, she drove her probe rod again through the railbed shoulder. First resistance, then sudden drop, then a muffled thump as trap water shifted below. When she pulled the rod, a thin jet followed and ran muddy down the slope. "Piping," she said aloud. "It's piping already." Lynn beside her frowned at the wet hole. He spoke in careful English. "Inside washout. Top looks strong. Under nose strong." "Yes." He pointed toward town with the mattock handle. "Tell boss?" "I've told every boss with boots." They walked to the worker tents at dusk, lantern between them. Laura showed men the seep, the probe hole, the fresh cracks feathering along the embankment toe. Some listened, arms folded against rain. Some looked away toward the depot as if official buildings could shield them by sight alone. A foreman from Red Sovereign, Mr. Pikely, arrived on horseback and shouted over the weather. "Back to camp. Company says no flood hazard, only seasonal standing water. Anyone leaving shift forfeits pay." One laborer muttered, "Pay no good if dead." Pikely heard and wheeled his horse. "Who said that?" Nobody answered. Rain answered for them, drumming on canvas and hat brims. Near the boarding houses, children floated bark chips in gutter streams that were already ankle deep. Mothers called them in laughing. "Storm game's over." As if this were only spring fun. At the saloon, men cheered when lightning hit the far ridge, counting seconds to thunder like gamblers at cards. "Storm's moving off," someone shouted after a brief lull. Laura looked west. The lull was the worst sign, a loaded sky gathering breath. She climbed the depot steps and pinned a fresh notice to the bulletin board with 2 nails driven hard. Canyon embankment, showing internal washout. Stop midnight powder freight. Scheduled stop move to high ground before 11 p.m. Within minutes, the station agent tore it down. You can't post unauthorized dispatch warnings. She met his gaze. Then post authorized ones. He crumpled the paper. Go home, Miss Harmon. Trying to keep people alive is home. By nightfall, runoff from the canyon reached town ditches in brown surges carrying twigs, dung, and 1 dead chicken. The creek itself still sat within banks, which reassured the untrained eye. But Laura knew the danger was above, trapped where water had no right to be. She and Eli forced a short halt on the ridge to swallow tea gone tannic on the stove, then set lantern pairs along the marked route. Wet coats steamed by the kitchen door. Outside, water finally whispered in the trench they had cut that morning, a narrow testing run finding the line they had made. Laura stood in the doorway listening. It sounded like a promise and a threat. At 9 o'clock, she and Eli climbed to a knoll with view to the spur line. Lightning stitched the clouds, showing the embankment in brief white negatives. Between flashes, she heard a new sound under wind, a deep, intermittent groan, earth moving against itself. Eli hugged his coat tight. Could hold till morning. Could fail in 10 minutes, Laura said. He pointed toward town, most still in their beds. Then we wake them. She handed him a bundle, red lantern, wrench, and the short iron bar used for switch throw locks. You go to the lower switch tower. If I'm not there in 20, start setting red by yourself. He stared at her. Sheriff said arrest. Sheriff can arrest me breathing later. Ruth rode up behind them on Buck, rain streaming from her hat brim, a coil of rope over one shoulder and shotgun scabbard tied behind the saddle. Not for people, for snakes and panic animals. Upper pasture fires are laid, she said. Mrs. McNabb has kettle on. Clara's guiding children from laundry row already. Laura felt a hard, brief swell in her chest, fear braided with pride. Good. Another flash lit the canyon. This time they saw a fresh slump on the embankment face, dark as spilled ink. No one spoke. From far east, faint through storm, came the first thin whistle of a locomotive making time toward Dry Creek. The whistle sounded again. Thin, far, and wrong for weather. April 9th, Ruth said, as if pinning the date might pin the night in place. She checked the thermometer nailed to Buck's saddle tree. 34 and falling. Laura took one breath and spent it. Go. Eli ran downslope toward the lower switch tower, red lantern banging his knee. Ruth wheeled Buck toward the ridge yard, where the women were waiting on orders. Laura cut across the old creek crossing at a dead sprint, boots sinking to the ankles in mud that sucked and released like hands. At 9:18 p.m., the storm changed shape. Rain went from vertical to slanting hard under a wind shift out of the west. Hail began, pea-sized at first, then marble-sized, rattling off rail and rock. Lightning flashed and showed the embankment face in white relief. Fresh cracks, a dark boil at the toe, and a strip of slope that had sagged 6 feet since sunset. Then came the sound she had dreaded most. Not thunder, not water, but a deep interior tearing, like cloth ripped inside the earth. The embankment failed in a partial slump. Not a full break yet. Worse in some ways. A wedge of saturated fill dropped, opening a jagged mouth low on the west shoulder. Pressured water shot through in a brown jet and immediately began carving. In less than 30 seconds, the jet widened from a shovel width to a wagon width, carrying gravel, ties, and chunks of tamped clay downstream into the old side channel. Laura hit the slope and shouted until her throat burned. Pins! Pull Westgate pins! Lynn and his cousins were already there, waist deep at the first side channel control. Lynn swung the iron bar twice. The pin held. Third blow bent it. Fourth blow sheared the rust seam and the plank gate dropped out. Water took the opening with a violent gulp and swung left toward the orchard ground as planned. For 60 seconds the plan worked. Then debris arrived. Brush, fence posts, one broken henhouse roof, and jammed the throat. The diverted flow backed, rose, and spilled over the channel lip toward worker tents anyway. "Clear it," Eli yelled, appearing out of dark with the second bar. He and Lynn hacked at the jam while hail stung their faces raw. They freed half. The rest held. At 9:31, the second failure came. The main trench on the Harmon side did its job until a section near Stake 5, where the clay seam had always worried Laura, sloughed inward under load. One bank caved, cutting capacity by half. Water climbed the trench edge and sheeted across the yard, slamming into sandbag crescents. 2 stacks held. The third tipped and rolled like loaves. Ruth came down the line with Mrs. McNabb and Clara, shoving bags back into place with boot heels and hips. "Not pretty," Ruth shouted. "Just keep it moving." A lantern post went over. Another blew out. Root rags snapped in wind like gunshots. Their careful geometry of safety turned ragged within minutes. Below them, Dry Creek began to take Water Street by street. By 9:40 p.m., Toller's feedlot was knee-deep and rising. The boardwalk in front of Klein's Mercantile floated loose at one end and knocked against the hitch rail like a battering ram. Worker tents nearest the rail yard collapsed one by one, canvas flattening as if stepped on by giants. Men crawled out carrying bedrolls over their heads. Some went back in for trunks, came out empty-handed and shaking. A church bell started ringing in frantic, uneven strokes. Not scheduled, not prayer. Alarm. At 9:47, the first surge reached Mansion Row. Cutter and Vale had built their status on higher ornamental fill, imported soil, and carved drainage ditches designed for garden display, not flood force. Water ignored design. It found the carriage lane, ran under the iron gate arches, and pooled against stone retaining walls until one gave way. The wall collapsed in 3 blocks. Imported firs toppled root first. Marble statuary pitched forward and disappeared in brown current. One of Vale's gas lamps exploded with a blue pop and died. The gatehouse, where Laura had been turned away, took water through the lower office windows. Guards fought to drag account ledgers onto desks as current lifted rugs and chair legs. By 10:02 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 32. Rain turned to sleet and bursts, and floodwater took on that murderous cold that steals strength in minutes. For 1 hour and 14 minutes after the first slump, nothing stayed as built. The depot freight shed roof peeled at one corner and flapped. A culvert under River Street clogged with straw and manure, then blew out, taking half the roadbed with it. 2 wagons overturned in the wash near Laundry Row. Mules broke traces and ran blind into fences. Every shouted instruction lasted 3 seconds before wind shredded it. And through all of it, at intervals, the eastbound locomotive whistled, closer each time. Community broke by neighborhood, then by household. At the worker quarter, Laura and Eli moved tent to tent with 2 lanterns and a coil of rope, tying people together in groups of 5 so nobody vanished in the dark. They got 23 uphill on the first run. On the second, they found Mr. Pikely, the same foreman who had threatened pay forfeits, chest deep in water by the cook tent, trying to lever a beam off a pinned section hand. "Leave the beam," Eli shouted. Pikely spat mud and shook his head. "Legs under." Laura waded in, drove her shoulder under the beam beside him and counted. 1, 2, heave. They shifted it enough for Lynn's cousin to drag the trapped man free by his coat. The cousin screamed once, broken ankle, bad angle but alive. A new surge hit. Pikely turned to follow and stepped into a hole scoured where tent stakes had been. He went down to the armpits, came up once. Then a floating crate struck his temple. By the time Eli got a grip on his collar, Pikely's eyes were open but gone empty, face tilted to sleep. They hauled him to higher mud and covered him with canvas they did not have time to tie. At the depot, Mr. Pike, the telegraph operator, stood at his key and water to his calves, sending Blind into a line that sparked each time wind took the wire. "Hold extra 14. Cut unstable. Hold," he hammered. "Pike," Laura shouted from the door. "Out." He shook his head without turning. "Need acknowledgement." The freight shed wall failed first. A stack of grain sacks slammed into the office side, blew in the lower frame, and knocked him against the table. He tried to rise, one hand still on the key. Then the stove tipped, steam and ash burst up, and a ceiling joist dropped across his back. Laura and Eli lunged for him, but the current inside became a grinder of wood and glass. Eli took a cut across his cheek from flying pain. Ruth dragged them backward by both coats as the room collapsed inward. The key kept clicking weakly underwater for several seconds, then stopped. At the church, Reverend Coates climbed the belfry stairs with a hand lantern and rang until his shoulder failed. People heard and came, some barefoot, some carrying children in quilts, some still in Sunday coats over nightclothes. The west stair stringer, soaked for years and never repaired, split under load on the descent. Coates pushed two girls ahead through the hatch and took the fall himself. They found him later crumpled beneath broken rail, one hand still wrapped around the bell rope. Mrs. Pruitt died on the ridge path 50 yards from the cellar door. She had spent the evening cutting root ties, then gone back down for the Hale boy when his mother slipped in the ditch by Boarding House Row. She got the child onto a sled drag, pulled him and his mother both up the first incline, and then sat down hard beside the marker post as if to catch breath. When Clara reached her, Pruitt was conscious but shivering so violently she bit her own tongue. Cold water and age had taken too much. They wrapped her in 2 waxed blankets and carried her anyway. She died with her hand gripping the white root rag she had tied herself. By 10:30, the Harmon cellar held 62 people, then 78, then 91. Mud pooled at the threshold despite sandbags. Breath and wet wool turned air sour and warm. Children cried until exhausted, then slept against strangers' knees. Ruth and Mrs. McNabb ladled bean broth from the kettle in tin cups, 1 swallow each to start, then half cups when they could. No one mocked Harmon's Ark now. They asked where to stand, what to carry, who needed the next blanket. Eli posted names on barrel staves with charcoal as people came in, so separated family could be matched. Hale, 3 present/1 missing. Lindcamp, 7 present/2 injured. Laundry Row, all present. Outside, the unprepared places became traps. Cellars in town filled from below because owners had stored flour and coal at floor level, not above knee height. Single-road homes on the flats discovered too late that their bridge planks had floated off. Families that had trusted one warning source waited for official notice that never came, then ran all at once into waist-deep dark. The contrast was brutal in details. On the ridge, lanterns in pairs, tinder dry in oilcloth, route markers every 40 yards. Below, 1 lost lamp meant blind wandering. On the ridge, barrels already full. Below, people scooped floodwater for thirsty children and spat mud. On the ridge, spare harness hung where mice and damp couldn't ruin it. Below, straps snapped in panicked teams and wagons jackknifed in alleys. At 10:41, Laura climbed out of the cellar into sleet to check the north path and heard voices shouting her name from the dark, hoarse, urgent, unfamiliar in tone because fear had scraped off pride. "Miss Harmon! Harmon!" A figure stumbled into lantern range, One of Vale's gate guards, the same man who had barred her from the iron walk. His cap was gone, coat torn open, face bloodied at the eyebrow. He bent double, hands on thighs, trying to get air. Gatehouse flooded. Carriage lanes a river. Mrs. Vale and the Cutter children are trapped in the conservatory wing. Glass doors jammed, water rising to the piano. Sheriff says all wagons turn back. He swallowed hard and forced the words out. He said, "You know the high routes. Please." Behind him came Sheriff Dunn himself, on foot, hatless, one deputy limping with an arm in a sling of his own coat. Dunn stopped 3 paces from Laura as if distance might preserve whatever authority he had left. "I should have listened this afternoon," he said, voice raw. "No time for that now. We need your routes, your people, your stock, anything that moves. Town's splitting in 2. If that powder train comes through..." Laura cut him off. "How many stranded at the gates?" 30, maybe more. Mostly families and servants. Some workers trying to cross got pinned against the wall. "Any line to the switch tower?" "Telegraph's dead. Signal lamps intermittent." Another whistle knifed the storm, much nearer now, followed by the low iron thunder of a train taking grade in bad weather. Laura looked once toward the packed cellar door, where her mother stood framed in lamp glow, handing out dry socks from a crate labeled in Ruth's neat script months before. Then she looked at the sheriff, the guard, the deputy, all 3 dripping and shivering on her mud porch. "No conditions," she said. "You carry who we point to. You don't argue triage, and you take orders from whoever has dry hands and a shovel. Understood?" Dunn nodded immediately. The guard nodded before him. Laura turned and shouted into the yard. "Eli, Lynn, rope teams to Mansion route. Clara, mark every 3rd post with 2 lamps. Mrs. McNabb, clear cellar center for new intake." She grabbed the red lantern and iron bar again. "Sheriff, you wanted lawful warning? You're getting it. I'm going to the switch." Dunn caught her sleeve once, then let go. "If the engineer won't stop..." Laura's face went flat in the sleet. "Then I stop him another way." She and Eli hit the handcar track at 10:49 p.m., pumping into the storm while behind them the ridge lanterns burned like a chain of small, stubborn stars above a drowning town. The handcar bucked over joints, iron wheels shrieking every time sleet froze in the flange. "Pump!" Laura shouted. Eli pumped until his shoulders shook. Water sheeted across the track at low spots, forcing them to lift weight and coast, then drive again. The red lantern tied to the car's front post swung wild arcs that painted the rails in blood-colored light. They reached the lower switch tower at 10:57. The tower door hung open, banging in the wind. Inside, the signal lever for eastbound Main still sat it clear. Eli slammed it to stop. The linkage groaned. Laura ran up the ladder to the lamp gallery, teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue. She swung the semaphore arm by hand and clipped the red lens in place, then lit the wick with a tinder that sputtered twice before catching. In the storm, the red looked tiny, 1 coal in a black furnace. "Not enough," she said, dropping back down. From the east, the locomotive whistle answered, nearer, urgent and still on schedule. They shoved the handcar onto the siding and sprinted for the grade crossing, where the track bent and climbed over shale. If a train was going to slow anywhere, it was there. By the time they reached it, Laura's lungs burned like she had swallowed cinders. She set the lantern dead center between rails and waved both arms in broad cuts. Eli took the second lantern and ran 50 yards upline, doing the same. Headlight glare broke through sleet like a comet. Engine 14 came on. Black boiler shining with rain. Drive rods flashing. She saw the engineer leaning out. Saw him yank the whistle once, twice, warning, not stopping. "Brake!" she screamed. "Brake!" The locomotive thundered past, wind and spray slamming her backward. For one heartbeat, she thought it was over. Then grade and floodwater did what authority would not. The train lost speed climbing into the bend. Laura ran. She caught the ladder on the tender's rear corner, boots slipping. Eli grabbed her coat and shoved, and she hauled herself onto wet steel just as the handhold tore skin from her palm. A brakeman shouted and lunged. She shoved past him toward the cab. Inside, heat hit like an oven. Coal fire roar, steam hiss, men cursing. "What in God's name?" The engineer barked, one hand on throttle, the other on reverse lever. He had gray in his beard and eyes bloodshot from night run. "Powder cars," Laura gasped. "Cuts washing out. You take them through, we all die." "Get out of my cab." She slapped the dispatch copy onto the wet gauge shelf. "Storm watch order. I sent hold requests. No Aki came because your depot's underwater. You can smell the grade. Feel that drag? Subgrade's going." The fireman swore and pointed out the side window. "Tom, look." Ahead, beyond the curve, lightning lit the canyon face. Even from this distance, they saw moving earth, a dark tongue of slurry sliding across ballast. The engineer, Tom, then, made a decision so fast it looked like instinct. "Elias," he yelled to the brakeman, "set handbrakes on rear string. We cut at Quarry Spur. Move." He looked at Laura, fury and fear fighting in his face. "If you're wrong, miss, I lose my post." "If I'm wrong, you lose a schedule," Laura said. "If I'm right, you lose a town." At the old Quarry Spur switch, they stopped with wheels shrieking. Men jumped down in sleet. Couplings clanged, chains snatched, curses vanished in wind. Tom cracked the angle cock, bled air, and signaled. The engine and first freight cars lurched forward. The powder cars stayed, brakes screwed hard, stranded on the spur above the rising wash. One powder car door had already sprung from wet swelling. Rain and sleet drove in. Good, Laura thought wildly. Soak it all. Tom leaned from the cab. "Now what?" Laura pointed west, toward the dark line where Mansion Row stood. "You blow this whistle until the valley wakes. Long pulls. No station code. That's not protocol. Tonight protocol is breathing." For 1 second he hesitated. Then he jerked his chin. "Up here then. You pull, I drive." She climbed onto the cab step, then up to the narrow roof lip, one arm hooked around the whistle rope. Eli hauled himself in behind Tom, shivering and grinning with terror. Engine 14 rolled downhill toward Dry Creek, bell clanging, headlights slicing rain. Laura leaned her weight onto the rope and held. The whistle tore the night open. Not too short, not crossing signal. One long, unbroken animal howl that echoed off canyon walls and came back multiplied. She let it die only long enough to breathe, then pulled again, longer. Windows flared to life all over town. At Cutter and Vale's iron gates, people appeared in nightshirts and coats, thrown over bare arms, faces white in gaslight. Guards waved frantically. Sheriff Dunn stood knee-deep in current, pointing toward the conservatory wing where lamplight flashed behind jammed glass doors. Laura climbed down to the running board and shouted through cupped hands, "Leave trunks. Leave furniture. Take children, blankets, boots if they're by the door. Follow lantern posts to Harmon Ridge." A man in a silk dressing gown yelled back, "Who gave you authority?" She yanked the whistle again in his face until he flinched. "Water did." Tom eased the engine as close to the gate as flooded ground allowed. Eli and 2 guards used a fence rail as a ram and shattered the conservatory latch. Women stumbled out carrying wrapped bundles that were babies, not valuables. One of Cutter's little boys clutched a cage with a soaked canary and would not let go. Ruth took the cage and the child, both when they reached the wagon line. Then the mountain finally let go. At 11:43, the embankment above the cut ruptured full. It sounded like cannon fire followed by continuous thunder. A wall of black water, ties, and clay roared through the breach, hit the first channel gate, and split. Some toward worker quarter, much of it caught by the trenches and emergency notch the Harmons had cut by hand. Ruth was there with Lynn, shoulder to shoulder in sleet, pulling the last plug sandbags from the west berm. "Now!" she yelled. The notch blew open. Floodwater took the new path, arcing hard across orchard ground and slamming into the ornamental terraces above Mansion Row. Stone lions disappeared. Imported shrubs vanished. The broad lawns that had been dry status all year became a sacrificial basin, churning with debris instead of bodies. Down by worker tents, surge still came, hard and cold, but knee to waist, not roof high. Enough to drown the unwary, not enough to harass every soul asleep. All night the whistle sounded in long pulls while rope teams moved people by lantern chain. At the Ridge Cellar, rescue became discipline. No one comes in dry space with boots full of mud. "Scrape there," Ruth said, pointing with a ladle as if commanding a kitchen brigade. Children and injured on east wall. Men who can stand. You are hauling water from barrel 3 to the stove. You, to a merchant who had once laughed at Harmon's Ark, are cutting blanket strips for bandages, straight, not fancy. Mrs. Vale arrived shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Her velvet slippers were gone. Her feet were wrapped in curtain cloth. She started to say, "I can pay." Ruth handed her a tin cup. "You can stir beans." In a corner, Laura knelt with 6 boys from rail camp and showed them how to twist rope from feed sack strips when hemp ran short. 3 strands, then counter twist, she said, guiding their fingers. You make one length, pass it left. Don't look at the storm. Look at your hands. At another table, Clara taught 2 store clerks to pack a warming bed, dry blanket, hot stone wrapped in cloth, wet persons stripped and rubbed hard at wrists and neck first. Eli took names, then made each able-bodied newcomer repeat route landmarks back to him before he sent them out with teams. "Say it," he told Cutter himself, who stood drenched and stunned under a borrowed wool coat. Cutter swallowed. Lantern pair at split stump, white rag on fence post, left at broken wagon tongue, up to basalt shelf. Again, Eli said. By 2 a.m., they had 3 shelter zones, cellar for children and hypothermic, house floor for elders, and upper pasture windbreak for teams and overflow adults. The cistern water was rationed by cup marks scratched into a ladle handle months ago. Salt pork was boiled thin with beans and stale rolls. No one complained. Outside, expensive things failed loudly. Mansion generators drowned. Imported wallpaper peeled in sheets. Marble cracked in sudden cold. Inside the Harmon place, cheap things held because they were chosen for this exact night. Tarred plank lids, raised grain bins, spare leather kept dry, lanterns in pairs, food salted and high. Near dawn, the storm spent itself into ragged rain. Engine 14 sat silent by the gates. Fire dropped low. Whistle rope frayed where Laura had burned her palms raw. At the quarry spur, the powder car stood with doors gaping, black powder sodden into useless paste. When gray light came, Dry Creek looked like a town dragged behind a plow, but it stood. Not everyone did. They laid Mr. Pikely, Mr. Pike the operator, Reverend Coates, and Mrs. Pruitt in a row under canvas by the church fence, where mud was least deep. People moved hatless past them, speaking in whispers that sounded like prayer even when they weren't. 3 days later, the surviving church was too damaged for assembly, so the town crowded into Klein's freight barn. The air smelled of wet wool, lime, and fresh sawn pine from emergency repairs. Planks on barrels made a rough dais. Judge Bell sat stiff-backed with a bandage around his forehead. Sheriff Dunn stood beside him without hat or badge pinned, just a tired man in a clean shirt. Cutter and Vail came together, coats plain for once, boots still mud-stained at the seams no servant had cleaned. Laura arrived late from hauling feed to displaced teams. She took a place near the back by Lynn and Clara, expecting speeches about losses and donations. Instead, Dunn cleared his throat and said, voice carrying to the rafters, "This is not routine council business. This is reckoning." Murmurs died. He held up a soggy newspaper broadside, married to Calamity, now dried and wrinkled flat. This ran in our town while Miss Harmon was digging channels that saved our families. No one laughed. Reverend Coates's replacement, young Pastor Webb with shaking hands, read from a paper signed by the church board. We confessed that we spoke against warning as if warning were sin. We failed our duty to protect the vulnerable. We ask forgiveness from the Harmons and from God. Then Mrs. Hale stood from the crowd, eyes red-rimmed. I brought stale bread in secret because I was afraid of what folks would say. My boy is alive because her lanterns were tied where she said they'd be. I'm done being secret. One by one, people spoke. Some brief, some stumbling. The station agent. I tore down her notices. I thought rules would protect us. Rules drowned with my office. A feed store teamster. I mocked the sandbags. Slept on my wagon roof till dawn because her trench kept the water off the ridge road. Judge Bell, jaw tight. The court relied on certified engineering and lawful survey. I did not permit full challenge. He swallowed as if the next words scraped. The record will be reopened. All eyes turned to Cutter and Vail. Vail began in polished tones, habit hard to break. The company grieves losses and say the plain thing, someone shouted. Cutter lifted a hand. He looked older by 10 years, cheeks hollow from 3 sleepless nights. Plain thing, he said. We were warned, repeatedly. We dismissed those warnings because they came from a claimant we had beaten in court. His voice roughened. We treated prudence as obstruction and paid for it with lives not ours to spend. He nodded to a clerk who carried forward a leather folio and laid it on the plank dais. Vail opened it. Red Sovereign Railroad and associated signatories submit this restitution agreement effective immediately, pending territorial filing. He read each clause aloud while the barn listened in hard silence. First, restoration of Harmon family water rights at the original creek crossing, including easement for access and maintenance. Ruth, beside Laura now, did not move. Second, transfer of title for 6 acres of reclaimed bottomland previously taken under Survey Correction Number 17B. A rustle through the crowd. Third, wage fund, jointly financed by Red Sovereign and private Cutter Vale Estates for rebuilding worker homes on map-safe ground above the 100-year floodline. Wages paid directly to laborers, including Chinese crews, without intermediary deduction. Lynn looked at Laura once, unreadable, then back to the dais. Fourth, independent review of embankment design in all culvert capacities with public posting of findings. Fifth, withdrawal of complaint actions against Laura Harmon, Ruth Harmon, Eli Harmon, and associates. Vail stopped, then added quieter. And personal apology entered into record. He looked at Laura directly. Miss Harmon, Mrs. Harmon, Eli, I am sorry. Cutter nodded, unable or unwilling to decorate it. So am I. Silence held. Rain tapped the barn roof in light, innocent drops as if no storm had ever happened. Judge Bell uncapped a fountain pen. Miss Harmon, you may bring suit for damages beyond this agreement. Criminal negligence claims may also— Put the pen down, Laura said. He blinked. Excuse me? Put it down. I'm not here to strip carcasses." A few heads turned, surprised. Dunn watched her carefully. Laura stepped forward to the dais. Her left palm was wrapped where the whistle rope had burned it. She laid that bandaged hand on the folio. "My father kept a survey notebook," she said. "I found it in the signal shack. It shows the old spillway line, with witness trees and chain marks. Somebody moved that line on paper so the company could claim the choke point." She looked at Cutter and Vale. "You can call that greed. I call it bad math with bodies." She faced the room. "Here's what happens next if you want me to sign anything. No vigilante rope, no arson talk, no boys proving courage with dynamite at somebody's gate. We bury our dead and build right." She counted on her fingers. "Public warning protocol. 3 long whistle blasts means immediate high ground evacuation. No waiting for official confirmation. Every household gets the signal card nailed by the door. Yearly preparedness drills, spring and fall. Not run by officials alone, run by ranch wives, rail hands, shopkeepers, laundresses, and any child old enough to carry a lantern. Floodworks Cooperative. We cut and maintain channels together. We store community blankets, grain, and lamp oil above floodline. Rotating inventory, posted publicly. Multiple routes always. No neighborhood with one bridge out." She turned to Judge Bell. "You want lawful? Write that into ordinance and charter, not into sermons after funerals." Webb, the young pastor, whispered, "Amen," before he could stop himself. There was no applause at first, just a long exhale from a room that had been braced for vengeance and found responsibility instead. Then Clara started clapping once, sharp. Mrs. Hale joined. Lynn struck his palm twice against his fist. Soon the whole barn was thunder and tears, and people not quite looking at each other, because looking meant admitting too much. Judge Bell set his pen down, picked up a different one, and wrote. That evening, Cutter came alone to the Harmon Ridge carrying no entourage, only a tin of coffee and a folded map tube. Eli led him through the gate without friendliness and without spite. Cutter stood awkwardly by the cistern, hat in both hands. "I came to ask where the new worker row should go," he said. "Not where it's convenient, where it lives." Laura took the map, spread it on a crate, and weighted corners with stones. She marked 2 ridges with charcoal, then the old willow swale and projected flood paths. "Here," she said, "and here. Build stilted foundations if you insist on lower lot. Drainage ditch 6 feet wide minimum, maintained monthly. No one stores coal in below-grade cellars." Cutter nodded, writing as she spoke. At the end, he hesitated. "My wife says Ruth saved our youngest from glass water. You owe wages paid on time," Ruth said from the porch. "Start there." He almost smiled, then sobered. "Yes, ma'am." By first snow, the gates that once shut out panic visitors were where the town gathered at midnight. The iron arches had been repaired but left unpainted, rust showing through like scar tissue. A new whistle post stood beside them with a brass plate. "Public warning signal. 3 long blasts equals high ground now." Children in wool caps stamped their boots in frost, while adults checked lantern wicks against lists. Lynn's crew had laid stone-lined channels all autumn. Eli had become official keeper of route markers, carrying a ledger thicker than the old railway timetable. Ruth supervised blanket stores in the communal loft, rejecting any bundle not rolled tight enough to shed rain. "Ready?" Laura called. Tom, the engineer, post reinstated after testimony, leaned from Engine 14's cab, now repainted but still bearing a dent from flood debris. "On your mark, Miss Harmon." She looked over the crowd. Shopkeepers, widows, ranch hands, barons in plain coats, schoolchildren holding signal cards, sheriff without swagger, Judge Bell with mud still on his boots from afternoon ditch clearing. "Mark." Tom pulled. 3 long blasts rolled over Dry Creek, across rebuilt roofs and new worker homes on higher ground, up to the ridge cellar door, where a fresh white rag fluttered from the post. No one ran in panic. They moved in practice lines, families to assigned routes, rope teams to stations, kettle crew to stove, head counters to chalkboards. In 11 minutes, everyone stood accounted for on safe ground, breathing steam into the winter dark. Pastor Webb checked his watch and grinned like a boy. 11 minutes, 20 seconds. Beat last drill by 40. Mrs. Vale, cheeks red from cold and work, ladled coffee into tin cups beside Clara. Cutter hauled sandbags with 2 rail hands and did not speak unless spoken to. Vale knelt to retie a child's bootlace with fingers that had once only signed ledgers. Laura stood by the whistle post, palm scar pale against the brass. A little girl tugged her coat. Miss Harmon, why do we do it at midnight? Laura crouched to her height. Because danger doesn't wait for daylight. And because if we can do it tired and cold, we can do it any time. The girl nodded solemnly and ran back to her line. Years later, when spring storms rolled black over the canyon, Dry Creek still listened for water, but it no longer trusted hope alone. Routes were marked before clouds formed. Grain stayed high. Spare leather stayed dry. No one laughed at 2 roads out. And every winter at the same gates where power once mocked caution, the midnight whistle sounded long and clear, and the valley answered together.